The silence of the Arctic night was shattered by the deep, rumbling roar of engines. Above the Norwegian fjords, a group of bombers sliced through the frigid air, their wings cutting through the dark like blades through still water. Below, the massive shadow of the Tirpitz stretched across the icy waters, its towering hull reflecting the cold moonlight like some mythical creature, poised and waiting for its prey. For years, this German battleship had been a symbol of dominance, a floating fortress that struck terror in the hearts of the Allied forces. But tonight, the balance of power was about to shift. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Hargreaves gripped the sides of his bomber's cockpit, his knuckles white, the cold seeping into his bones despite the warmth of the cockpit. He had trained for this moment for months, perhaps even years, but as he looked out over the water, his pulse quickened. The Tirpitz, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was anchored deep within the fjord, surrounded by jagged cliffs that seemed to mock any hope of an easy attack. A fortress, both on the sea and in the minds of the Germans. They believed it was untouchable. They were wrong. Harry had heard the rumors. The Tirpitz had been the Germans' trump card in the North Atlantic. A ship that could single-handedly destroy entire convoys, one that made even the bravest pilots hesitate before launching an assault. Every time the Tirpitz surfaced, a fresh wave of fear swept through the Allies. The ship was practically a fortress, well-defended, well-armed, and deeply entrenched in a natural, seemingly impenetrable cove. For months, this battleship had eluded every effort to destroy it, but now there was something different in the air. The plans had changed. They had a chance. But it was not just brute force that was going to bring the mighty Tirpitz down. It would take more than sheer firepower. The Allies had learned a valuable lesson over the years. To defeat an enemy, sometimes you had to make them defeat themselves, to catch them off guard, to confuse them, to make them believe in something that wasn't there. The Tirpitz wasn't just a battleship, it was a symbol of German invulnerability. But tonight, that symbol would be shattered, not by an air raid, but by something far more insidious. As Harry's bomber began its final descent toward the target area, he couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival, or even for his squadron. He was fighting for something greater, for a world at war, for a victory that was long overdue. He thought about his family back in England, about the women and children in the streets who never felt the sting of fear that these soldiers knew. But tonight, he and his crew weren't fighting for them. They were fighting for survival, for the thousands of lives that would be spared if they succeeded. They had to succeed. The mission had been weeks in the making, every detail calculated and planned with precision. But Harry knew better than anyone that no plan survived first contact with the enemy. The Tirpitz had been a target before, but never like this. This time, the Allies weren't just going to attack the ship. They were going to make the Germans believe their entire fleet was under threat. They were going to make the Tirpitz move, to misdirect its defenders into making a fatal mistake. But as Harry's bomber banked sharply, narrowly missing a cluster of cliffs, doubt crept in. They were about to cross a line they had never crossed before. This was no longer just about taking down a ship. It was about breaking the German psyche. It was about making the Tirpitz's crew question everything they believed. The moment of truth was fast approaching. Ahead, the fjord stretched out like a dark, unforgiving labyrinth. The Tirpitz sat nestled within, a massive fortress of steel and firepower. The wind howling through the mountain pass like a predator stalking its prey. For all its might, it was isolated, vulnerable. But the Germans didn't see it that way. They had learned from the Bismarck's sinking. They had fortified the Tirpitz beyond measure. It would take more than bombs to bring it down. It would take deception, chaos, and fear. Harry could already hear the faint crackle of the radio as his crew spoke in hushed tones, the anticipation mounting. The whole mission, the entire Allied effort, rested on this single moment. If they failed, the Germans would remain undefeated in the north. If they succeeded, the impact would reverberate throughout the entire war effort. As they descended further into the fjord, the outline of the Tirpitz began to emerge, impossibly large against the backdrop of the dark, snow-covered mountains. Harry's heart raced. The sheer scale of the ship was breathtaking, but it also made the task ahead seem even more insurmountable. The Germans had never seen such a concentrated effort to destroy them. But they were about to. There was no turning back. There never was. The roar of the engines grew louder, and the light from the bomb bay doors shone through the dark as Harry's crew prepared for the impossible. But as they approached the final point of no return, one thought crossed Harry's mind. What if they had already won? What if the Germans were already primed for their fall? The air was thick with tension. The Tirpitz sat, motionless, in the fjord, its crew oblivious to the storm that was about to break. And then, with a deafening silence, everything went still. The Allies had a plan, but the Germans had something far more dangerous: overconfidence. It was time to set the trap. The story was about to unfold. The Allies had their chance. The question was, would the Germans see the trap before it was too late? The air in the cockpit was thick with tension. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Hargreaves gripped the controls of his Lancaster bomber with steady hands, but inside, his heart hammered against his chest like a drum. The target was in sight, the gargantuan Tirpitz sitting like a titan in the fjord, its black hull nearly blending into the night, save for the occasional flicker of its deck lights. Harry had trained for this moment his entire career, but nothing could prepare him for the psychological weight of the task at hand. He glanced to his left, where Flight Sergeant James "Jimmy" Barnes sat, his fingers trembling on the radar display. Jimmy was younger than Harry, but just as determined. Harry had seen the boy's face transform from fresh-faced enthusiasm to hardened resolve over the course of the war. But tonight, that same face showed a flicker of fear. Harry understood. The Tirpitz wasn't just any target. It was a symbol of German superiority, and taking it down was no simple feat. But they had no choice. This was a strike not just against the ship, but against everything the Germans believed in. And if they failed, the repercussions would be dire. "How are the other crews doing?" Harry asked, trying to cut through the tension. "Everything's set. They're ready for their roles," Jimmy replied, his voice low, but Harry could hear the uncertainty beneath it. "But, sir, what if this doesn't work? What if they're ready for us?" Harry turned his gaze back toward the fjord, the silhouette of the Tirpitz looming large. "It has to work, Jimmy. There's no other option. We're not just bombing a ship tonight, we're bombing a myth the Germans believe is invincible." But even as he spoke those words, Harry couldn't shake the gnawing feeling of doubt. The Germans had always been one step ahead, and they knew how to protect their precious Tirpitz. Harry had read the intelligence reports, studied the German defenses, and knew full well how difficult it would be to land a blow that would even scratch the ship, let alone sink it. The mission they were undertaking wasn't just an attack. It was a deception, a test of nerve. Allied intelligence had planted false information in the German ranks, creating the illusion that a larger force was coming for the Tirpitz. The Germans, believing their greatest weapon was under threat, had been pushed into a defensive frenzy, ready to strike first. But what they didn't know was that the true strike wouldn't come from the bombers, but from the clever, insidious distraction that had been set in motion long before this night. Behind Harry, in the rear of the plane, the crew was preparing for the worst. Corporal Tommy Jenkins was double-checking the payload, the massive 12,000-pound tallboy bombs that would bring the Tirpitz to its knees. Tommy had been with Harry for years, a reliable and steady presence. But even Tommy's usual calm demeanor seemed fractured tonight. His eyes flickered toward the window, watching the fjord edge closer, and Harry saw a flash of something else in his expression. Not fear, but a deep, gnawing regret. "Tommy, you all right?" Harry asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Tommy didn't answer at first. He kept adjusting the bombs with mechanical precision, as if his hands were acting independently of his mind. Finally, he turned to Harry, his face pale beneath the thin layer of sweat that dotted his forehead. "It's not the bombing, sir. It's the cost," Tommy said softly, his voice a whisper in the chaos of the cockpit. "You've seen the reports. The Tirpitz. It's more than a ship. It's a symbol. If we succeed, what happens to those who believe in it?" Harry didn't need to ask what Tommy meant. They were both aware of the cost of war, the toll it took on both sides, the destruction it wrought. And while Harry understood the necessity of what they were doing, he also knew that the sinking of the Tirpitz would have consequences far beyond military strategy. It would be a psychological blow, not just to the German Navy, but to the morale of the German people. The myth of invincibility would crumble, and in its place, doubt would settle in. But could they afford to care about that now? Could they afford to consider the broader consequences when millions of lives hung in the balance? Harry's thoughts were interrupted as the intercom crackled to life. It was Squadron Leader Matthew "Matt" O'Neill, the leader of the second bomber, whose crew would also be participating in the operation. "We're in position, Harry. You know what to do." Matt's voice came over the speaker, cool and calculated, masking the tension that ran just beneath the surface. Harry's grip tightened on the controls. It was time. No more doubts. The plan was set. Their crews had already done their part, laying the groundwork of deception with misdirected radio transmissions, fake decoy fleets, and mock bombardments. Now they were here, in the heart of the storm, staring down the beast. The psychological game had begun. The Tirpitz, sitting like a beast waiting to strike, seemed almost to pulse with life, its massive hull rippling under the glow of distant lights. As Harry's bomber continued its descent, his mind shifted focus. They were in enemy territory now. Every second mattered. One mistake, one misstep, and the entire mission could collapse. The Germans had a formidable air defense system, and the mountain terrain could scramble their signals, making precision difficult. But worse than that, if the Germans realized they were being deceived, if they saw through the ruse, everything could be lost. The Allies needed to ensure that the Germans believed they were facing a full-scale attack. The entire success of the mission rested on the psychological warfare they had set into motion. 10 miles out, Jimmy reported, his voice clipped now, the earlier tremor gone. "Hold tight, Harry. We're almost there." Harry's pulse quickened. The final approach was upon them. He could see the other bombers in the distance, their formation tightening as they lined up for their run. It was now or never. Below, the Tirpitz remained oblivious, its crew still adjusting to the imagined threat. It was a momentary advantage, but it was all they had. The Germans were on the brink of panic, and once the bombs were released, nothing would be the same again. "Steady," Harry whispered to himself, eyes locked on the massive ship beneath. "Steady and strike true." As the bombers cut through the night, the tension in the air became almost tangible. This was the moment of truth. The psychological war had reached its peak. Would the deception work, or would the Germans, in their desperation, shatter their own defense before the Allies had a chance to strike? The darkness seemed to close in around them, the fjord growing narrower, and Harry's heart raced faster. Something was about to happen. Something big. But what? He could only guess. The world seemed to slow as the distance between Harry's Lancaster bomber and the Tirpitz narrowed. The roar of the engines reverberated through the hull of the plane, but the hum of the aircraft seemed distant compared to the thudding in Harry's chest. His breath was shallow as the fjord stretched out beneath them, the jagged cliffs rising on either side like walls of stone, trapping them in a cold, unforgiving box. 5 miles to target." Jimmy's voice was tense over the intercom. The mission had reached the point of no return. There was no more room for mistakes, no more second chances. Harry's mind raced, not with calculations or tactical analysis. Those had all been made in the days leading up to this moment. No, now his thoughts were occupied with something else entirely. Doubts. The weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on his mind. The deception had worked thus far. The Germans were on edge, prepared for an attack that never came. But now as they closed in on the Tirpitz, Harry had to ask himself, what if they were wrong? The mission was based on the assumption that the Germans would be rattled by the false reports, the fake fleet, and the misdirection. But there was always the chance that the Germans, in their desperation, had anticipated the ruse. They were aware of the Allies' tactics, their games of misinformation. What if they had figured it out? What if this had all been for nothing? In that moment, Harry realized that the deception was not just a strategy, it was a gamble. A gamble with lives, with the fate of the war itself hanging in the balance. The Tirpitz was not just a ship, it was a symbol of German resilience. If they succeeded, the blow would not only be to the ship, but to the very core of the German military spirit. But if they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Allies would lose their psychological edge, and the Tirpitz, an asset the Germans would defend with everything they had, would continue to terrorize the North. Harry's fingers tightened on the controls. There was no turning back now. They had come too far, and the enemy was too close. But then, a sudden voice crackled over the intercom, the words sharp and urgent. "Harry, we've got a problem." It was Tommy back in the rear with the bombs. "What's happening?" Harry barked, his pulse quickening. "We've got a malfunction. The secondary bomb release mechanism isn't responding. We can't drop the payload as planned." Tommy's voice was filled with panic, and Harry felt the ground beneath him shift. It was as if the earth had opened up beneath their feet, and all the ground they had carefully prepared for weeks was crumbling away. "Is it fixable?" Harry demanded, struggling to remain calm. "We're trying, sir, but it's going to take too long." Tommy's voice broke. "If we don't drop now, we're going to miss our window. The Germans will realize we're here before we can strike." Harry's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced to his left at Jimmy, who was staring at him with wide eyes. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. "Can we make it work, Jimmy?" Harry asked through gritted teeth, hoping for a miracle. He didn't have time to waste. Jimmy looked at the radar screen, his finger tracing a line over the terrain. His eyes darted nervously toward the growing outline of the Tirpitz. "We're running out of time," he muttered. "We can't get another run in. This is it." Harry felt his chest tighten, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a vice. If they couldn't drop their payload, the mission was doomed. The deception would be exposed, the Germans would retaliate, and the Allies would lose any advantage they had gained. The ground rushed toward them, the cliffs now nearly at their level. Harry's thoughts whirled, but there was no time for contemplation. The decision had to be made. "Matt's crew is behind us," Harry said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside. "We've still got time. We'll have to release manually. We won't be able to use the bomb bay doors. Tommy, can you do it?" Tommy's voice came back, strained but determined. "I'll make it work, sir." Harry exhaled slowly. His mind flickered to the consequences of failure. The war, the deception, the lives of his crew, and the safety of countless others hung in the balance. And yet the choice was clear. He had to trust his men, trust the plan. They could not afford to fail. "We're going in," Harry said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Do what you need to do, now." As he made the final adjustments to the plane's descent, the eerie silence of the night was broken only by the sound of rushing wind. The Tirpitz, massive and formidable, sat just ahead, unaware of the storm headed its way. It was as if time itself had slowed, the sense of anticipation mounting to a nearly unbearable level. Harry's thoughts raced. Would the Germans be prepared for this kind of attack? Were they already aware? Would the deception hold? His mind flickered to his family back home. The faces of his wife and children, far away in England, had become distant memories over the years of war. He had fought countless battles, seen many friends fall in battle, but nothing compared to this. The uncertainty, the fear, the knowledge that everything they had done, every sacrifice, led to this one moment. "Bombs away!" came Tommy's voice, tinged with disbelief. But there was no triumphant cheer, no relief. The bombs, though heavy and powerful, had not fallen as expected. The secondary release mechanism had failed again, and the bombs remained locked in place, despite Tommy's best efforts to trigger them manually. The moment Harry had feared most had arrived. His mind scrambled for a solution, his hands working the controls instinctively. He wasn't prepared for this. No one had planned for a malfunction at the critical moment. And then, like a jolt of electricity, it hit him. The Germans were already on high alert. They had moved the Tirpitz, anticipating an attack. But what if they weren't expecting a second wave? What if Harry could make the Germans believe they had miscalculated, that the deception was not just a distraction, but the real threat? If they could make the Germans think they were facing a full-scale assault, it might be enough to force their hand. A new plan had formed in his mind, a dangerous one, but it was their only shot. He turned to Jimmy, whose eyes were wide with confusion and fear. "We're going to need to improvise, prepare for a full assault. We're going to have to push this to the limit. Can you make that happen?" Jimmy swallowed hard but nodded. "I'll do it, sir. But this is going to get ugly." The clock was ticking. The Germans were starting to move. The plan was on the verge of collapse, and with it, their chance to deceive the enemy. Everything rested on this final push. Harry had one shot to turn the tide. But in doing so, he had to make a choice. The mission was no longer just about bombing a ship. It was about saving his men, and possibly saving the war. Would he be able to make the right call when everything was on the line? The air in the cockpit was thick, the tension palpable. There was no turning back now. The trap was set. The Germans had no idea what was coming next, and Harry, now at the helm, had to decide. Would they live to see the dawn, or would they be swallowed by the storm they had set in motion? The night was a living nightmare of twisting metal and frantic hearts. Harry's Lancaster, now alone in the frigid Arctic sky, was locked in a deadly dance with fate. The Tirpitz, massive and unyielding, loomed before them like an ancient beast, its guns tracking the bomber as it circled lower and lower, trying to find a way to complete the mission that seemed to be slipping from their grasp. Time was their enemy. Every second that passed increased the likelihood that the Germans would see through the deception, that they would realize the trap that had been set. They had failed to drop the bombs, the vital payload still locked tight in the bay, but Harry was not ready to give up yet. Not now. Not when everything they had worked for was so close. "Harry, we've got company!" Jimmy's voice was a sharp crackle over the intercom, his tone filled with terror. Harry's eyes snapped to the radar, but he already knew what was coming. German fighter planes were appearing on the horizon, their shapes silhouetted against the dark backdrop of the fjord. They had been waiting, lying in ambush, and now the Germans knew for certain that the attack was real. Harry's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about a failed bombing run anymore. This was a fight for survival. The Tirpitz's guns began to roar in the distance. Harry could feel the shock waves from the massive explosions reverberating through the plane, as if the very air around them had turned hostile. The ship, once a symbol of German pride and power, was now their executioner. Its gunners had finally figured out that they were being attacked, and they were intent on eliminating the threat. "Brace yourself," Harry yelled, the words barely audible over the noise of the roaring engines. He pulled hard on the yoke, twisting the plane into a sharp roll. Below, the Tirpitz fired once again, its enormous guns reaching toward them, sending plumes of water into the air as near misses splashed against the fjord's surface. Harry was on edge, every instinct screaming for him to fight, to flee, to do something to turn the tide. But there was no room to maneuver. The Germans were closing in, and they were closing fast. "We're losing altitude," Jimmy shouted, his voice thick with panic. "They've hit us. We've got a fire in the port wing." The fire, the heat from the flames that had begun to lick at the wing, was unbearable, and the smell of smoke filled the cockpit. Harry's mind raced, but his hands moved with the precision of years of training. There was no time for hesitation. He had to act. He needed to get them out of this, but the odds were stacked against them. "Tommy, can you get the bombs out?" Harry yelled, his voice rising in urgency. Tommy, who had been struggling with the release mechanism for what seemed like an eternity, now shouted back with a tremor in his voice. "It's no use. I can't get the release to work from here. We're running out of time." The realization struck Harry like a physical blow. The bomb bay was still locked. The mission, everything they had worked for, might come to nothing. He could hear the fighter planes drawing closer, their engines humming like predators preparing to strike. But it wasn't just about the bombs anymore. It was about getting his crew out alive. A sudden jolt shook the plane as another enemy fighter came into view, diving from the clouds, firing on them with precision. The Lancaster shuddered violently as a burst of bullets struck the fuselage, sending sparks flying. The fire in the port wing spread, and Harry could see the smoke curling into the cold air, a grim reminder that they didn't have much longer. His crew was rattled, and the clock was ticking down. "Evasive maneuvers!" Harry shouted, trying to steady the plane. But it was clear that they were fighting a losing battle. The aircraft was damaged, the odds stacked against them, and the Tirpitz was only a heartbeat away. If they didn't break free soon, they'd be engulfed. Through the chaos, a new voice cracked through the intercom. It was Matt, the leader of the second bomber. "Harry, we're coming in. We can't let you go down alone." It was a last-ditch attempt. The Allies had no way of knowing what the Germans were about to do. But Matt's voice offered a sliver of hope in the darkness. Harry's eyes flicked to the sky, watching the incoming fighters. Time seemed to slow, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. But then, something inside Harry snapped. He couldn't ask his men to die for a plan that was no longer working. They had already risked everything. The mission had failed, but they had to live. They had to fight another day. "Get out!" Harry yelled, his voice harsh with the weight of his decision. "I'm not losing anyone else today." Jimmy's shocked expression met Harry's eyes as he reached for the parachute harness. "What are you talking about, sir? We can still—" "Not like this," Harry cut him off, his voice firm with finality. "We're going to make it. Get to the escape hatches. We're abandoning the plane." There was a long pause, the weight of his words sinking in. The fire from the wing was getting worse, and the fighter planes were closing in fast. Harry could feel the heat from the flames begin to burn the interior of the cockpit, the smell of smoke and oil choking the air. Tommy, who had been frozen with fear, now sprang into action, his hands shaking as he tried to open the emergency hatch. His face was pale, but his determination never wavered. "I've got it, sir. The hatch is open." "Go, now!" Harry yelled. One by one, they scrambled toward the exits, their movements clumsy and rushed, the weight of their gear slowing them down. Harry watched as Jimmy was the first to jump, followed by Tommy and then the others. But the moment stretched on, and Harry knew. The longer he stayed, the more he risked not only his life, but theirs as well. He reached for the parachute, the weight of it pulling at his shoulders. But then a sudden roar of engines filled the air. The German fighters were coming in hot, their guns roaring in synchronized fury. The Lancaster shook again, this time more violently, and Harry felt a sharp jolt as the control yoke went loose in his hands. His heart thundered in his chest. There was no more time. With a deep breath, Harry pulled open the cockpit hatch, the wind rushing in, pulling at him like a torrent. He looked back one last time at the smoking plane, his crew now safely descending into the night. The Tirpitz was still there, looming like a shadow, but Harry had made his decision. He jumped. The cold air enveloped him as he fell, the weight of the world disappearing for a brief, terrifying moment. His parachute deployed with a sudden jerk, and the world settled into a quieter rhythm as he floated toward the snowy fjord below. He glanced up just in time to see the Lancaster explode, the flames lighting up the sky as the Germans' final assault found its mark. It was over. The plane had gone down. The mission had failed, but as Harry drifted toward the snow-covered earth, he knew that his crew was safe, and that despite the failure of their mission, they had survived. The Tirpitz, for all its might, was not the end. Not today. Not while they still had a chance. And with that, Harry knew. The war was far from over, but this battle, for now, had been won. The cold ground of Norway was unforgiving as Harry's parachute dragged him to the snowy earth. The impact rattled his bones, but it wasn't the physical pain that lingered. It was the crushing weight of failure. His crew had made it out alive, but the mission had not succeeded. The Tirpitz still stood, a testament to German resilience, untouched by their efforts. The deception, once so carefully crafted, had fallen apart in the face of overwhelming odds. And Harry, for all his experience and resolve, couldn't shake the feeling that something more important than the sinking of a battleship had been lost in the chaos. As he trudged through the snow, pulling himself into the cover of a nearby cluster of trees, Harry felt the cold seep deep into his flesh. But it was the emptiness inside that gnawed at him. The mission was meant to be the beginning of the end. A victory for the Allies, a blow to the German Navy's pride and power. Instead, it had turned into something else entirely. A gamble that hadn't paid off. A gamble that had nearly cost them everything. But Harry wasn't the only one feeling the burden of that failure. His crew, though they had made it out alive, was shaken. In their eyes, Harry saw the same doubt, the same fear that had begun to take root in his own heart. The war had taken so much from them already, and despite their best efforts, they were no closer to ending it than they had been before. Tommy, the reliable ground technician who had so desperately tried to make the bombs work, was the first to speak when they finally regrouped in the remote Norwegian wilderness. His face was pale beneath the dim light of the campfire they had set up, his eyes filled with questions that had no easy answers. "Did we make the right call?" Tommy's voice was quiet, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Harry sat in silence for a moment, his fingers trembling as he held his half-finished ration pack. He didn't know the answer. He couldn't bring himself to lie. He had led them into a trap, a mission so fraught with risk that it seemed destined for failure from the very beginning. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they had done the right thing, that in the end, survival was worth more than the mission itself. "We had no choice," Harry said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "We couldn't let them die for something that wasn't working. We still have a chance to fight another day." Tommy looked at him, searching his face for a certainty that Harry couldn't provide. But what about the others who didn't make it? The pilots who risked everything for a plan that failed? The question stung. They had lost good men, brave men, and their sacrifices could not be overlooked. And yet, Harry couldn't find it in himself to regret the decision. They had fought against the odds, and sometimes survival, the ability to continue the fight, had to be the final goal. Harry let out a long breath and gazed into the fire. Sometimes you make a decision, and you don't know if it's the right one. But in this war, sometimes the only thing we can control is how we live to fight the next battle. The words felt empty even as he spoke them, but there was truth in them, something deep that Harry couldn't deny. The war had taken so much already, so many lives lost, so many families torn apart, and yet they had made it through. They were still here, and as long as they were, they could still fight. That was what mattered. But the consequences of their failure would linger long after the war was over. The Allies had gambled everything on a mission that didn't succeed, and the Germans would remain confident in their superiority. The Tirpitz was still alive, still a symbol of power. The psychological blow they had hoped to deliver to the German Navy had not come to pass, and the road ahead seemed even darker than before. As the days passed, Harry and his crew were eventually picked up by an Allied rescue team. They were taken back to base, but the weight of the mission still hung heavily on their shoulders. The Allies had failed to stop the Tirpitz, and Harry knew the war would continue. The Germans had not been defeated, and every battle, every skirmish, was just a step toward an uncertain future. But despite the failure, there was something in Harry's heart that refused to break. He had led his men through the darkest hours, and though they had lost, they had survived. They were not the first to fall, and they would not be the last. The war would continue, but Harry knew this. Survival, no matter the cost, was victory in itself. Every day they lived was another day to continue the fight, and that was a victory no one could take from them. The months that followed were marked by more losses, more victories, and more uncertainty. The war did not end with the fall of the Tirpitz. It raged on, with the Allies continuing their relentless struggle against the German war machine. But Harry, though haunted by the failure of the mission, found a renewed sense of purpose. He had seen the price of war up close, but he had also seen the strength of those who refused to give up, and that strength would carry them through the darkest days yet to come. In 1945, after the war had ended, Harry received a letter from his old commanding officer. It was a simple note, but one that stayed with him for the rest of his life. "We did not lose the battle, Harry. We simply fought the wrong fight. What matters is that we are still here, and so are you. And that, in the end, is what matters most." The war had ended, but for Harry, the lessons of survival, of continuing to fight even in the face of failure, stayed with him long after the guns fell silent. Inspired by true events, the mission against the Tirpitz was one of many attempts by the Allies to destroy the German battleship, which was considered a significant threat in the North Atlantic. Despite the failure of several bombing attempts, the eventual sinking of the Tirpitz came in November 1944, when RAF Lancaster successfully dropped bombs on the ship, leading to its destruction. The Tirpitz had been a symbol of German naval power, and its eventual sinking was a significant blow to the Kriegsmarine.